So this is a continuation of the roughing out video from 2 weeks ago, and I just want to show my kiln. It's not a fancy device, but it works quite well. So I've got a cardboard box back here. I just have a weight on it to keep the flaps down. It's just what's going to be another bowl at some point. An aluminum foil shield, which is taped to the box to make a tunnel. The air comes in through here over a light bulb. You can see the light bulb glowing there. And then I have the light bulb, and then I have a computer fan. And that is enough to draw the air through that tinfoil shield tunnel, in through the fan and up through the box, and exits out here. I put 2 bowls in there last week. It would have been 6 days ago now. One is still in there. And this one, which if you remember my video is going to be an epoxy bowl, is dry. It's 10 to 12% moisture. That's plenty low enough to avoid any additional cracking. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare this for resin. The other bowl I just left in there. Again, it's less than 10%, but I'll just leave it there another day while I'm getting this one prepped for resin. First step I'm going to do is remove this bark. Although I like the look of the bark, it would give it a nice dark contrast. The problem with this bark is this. It is flaky, and not so much this, but the little pieces will break off and they'll end up floating in your epoxy, and it just makes a really bad look. So that's all got to come off. So I'm just going to use a combination of chisels, sanding wheels, grinding wheels, and get that all cleaned up. I'm also going to remove this piece back here because it's already loose. I don't think it will stay. As it dried, it pulled away. And again, it would be a candidate for floaties, which I do not want in the work. So I'm just going to go ahead and chip away at removing this, and then we'll come back once that's been done and form up for the epoxy. So I'm ready to start forming it up to pour the epoxy. I took a Dremel and I went in along this interface here and I cleaned all the bark off. Now you'll see there's still some brown, which really isn't bark. Technically it's a cambium layer, but it's pretty tight. It's more just a staining. There's nothing loose there that will come off. That's what you're trying to remove. Those loose pieces of bark that would end up coming off and would float in your epoxy and just make for dirt. This one was a little more difficult to clean all out in through here. I used a Dremel to get down in these cracks. Again, there is brown left in there, but nothing loose, so I think everything should stay fine. So I'm going to go ahead and form that up as well, and then we'll get ready to start pouring epoxy. So this one will be easy to fill. I just buy this shelf liner from the dollar store, and one side is smooth and the other side is ridged. Put the smooth side down. I'm just going to put that on there with hot melt glue, and that should prevent any leakage. So I'm going to put the hot melt glue as close to the seam without getting any down inside of it. Hot melt glue just will show up in the epoxy, make it look a little cloudy, so you really don't want that. You also don't want your epoxy leaking. Besides the expense, it probably means you're going to have to pour it again. See, I'm missing a little bit right there. peel it back. Get a little more on there. There, now I don't seem to have a gap. Extra assurance, I don't, especially on this bend here, I don't want any coming out. I follow some very talented people on the internet who do a lot of epoxy work. One that I've been following for years and well respected. Another New Brunswicker actually, Jim Sprague. Please check his channel out. I am by no means as talented as Jim is, especially when it comes to using epoxy. But I will also tell you another difference is he doesn't cheap out like I do. He would just pour this whole thing in one great big block of epoxy. I'm cheap and I can't afford that. And so I do form it up. I said there's only one thing, I'm cheap. So I'm going to form it up. Now, it is true that forming it up like this is going to save epoxy. That is true. But the one thing that it does for me, limits me, is if I decided to change the shape later on, I'm pretty well locked in because of where I poured that epoxy. It's only going to be an inch thick. So if I decided to change the slope on my walls to better show some figuring in the wood, that's not going to be an option for me because I don't have epoxy there. I only have epoxy where I formed it up. So that is a limitation, but also the difference between using a half a liter of epoxy versus 3 or 4. I said that I'm limited by the form on the epoxy shape. The reality is I'm also limited because I've already turned the bowl. So it's down to an inch of thickness. So I've already determined the shape of it. I was referring to had I have made the difference and poured the epoxy right at the very beginning before I even shaped the bowl in the first place. So in reality, it's the amount of wood that I have left that's limiting my artistic creativity. When I form it up, I use a combination of hot melt glue and also tuck tape. I find tuck tape works much better than duct tape for this application. And really what you want to do is make sure that you are not going to get any leaks. The epoxy is very expensive, so you want to make sure that when you pour it, you don't lose any of that material. So here I am just getting the epoxy ready. The epoxy I used for this project was Let's Resin. Now this resin is a 1-to-1, meaning that you use equal parts of A and B. Different resins are different. Some are 2-to-1, some are slow setting, some are fast setting. This is a relatively fast setting. Now I just add the green pigment to the epoxy, and you need to stir that for about 3 minutes, scraping down the sides of the wall, making sure that all of the epoxy and resin is well mixed. Once I'm done with the mixing, I just go ahead and I pour that in like form and just watch it to make sure that I'm not getting any leaks. At this point, if I do get a bit of a leak, I can still try and tape it up and stop it. But at this point, it seemed like it was going to hold fairly well. The wood is a little porous and it may absorb some of the epoxy, not that much. It did turn out that I did have a little bit of a leak. You can see that here on the opposite side, how it's spread out. It didn't leak beyond the form, but it just spread out onto the wood. Now this side, you will see that my form was not tight and I got a bit of a bulge, and it did leak some into the inside of the bowl, but not that much. I did end up making a little bit extra and pouring that in on top of what was already there. In hindsight, I probably ended up using about twice as much epoxy as what I needed. This side formed up well, the other side not quite so much. So I just glued a wooden block onto the bottom of my bowl and then mounted this between centers and started turning a new tenon so that I could flip the bowl around and then do the finished turning. It took me quite a while. I had to play with it quite a bit to figure out exactly where center was. The block that I glued on was big enough that I had room to move it one way or the other just to get it close to center. Okay, I'm not going to lie, it took a long time to get it centered. As you remember, I had lost my center reference point here, so it took quite a while. It seems like it would be an easy task, but the bowl's a bit out around, so finding center is not as easy of a task as it would seem. I'm pretty close here now. Again, the bowl is out around, but I'm hitting just right here, and opposite that, I'm taking less than 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to lose 1/4 of an inch thickness on the wall, but I still have lots, so I should be fine. That's why you leave it thick initially, because if it does, as it dries, as it changes, you'll still have enough room to true it up. So I'm just going to go down on the outside here, and there, as you notice, this epoxy wasn't smooth either, so I'll trim that up, and that'll help with the weight as well. So here I am. I've already established the outer diameter, but you'll notice that the rim is not level either, so I'm just working the top to make sure that I get it down so that I'm consistent all the way around on the top of the rim as well. Okay, we have it round. I've taken most of the lumps of the epoxy off now. You can see this is shaped well. Got a little bit more to go before I'm touching here. A little bit more up this corner. The inside, I actually did a little bit on the inside. I don't usually do that. I usually complete the outside and then go to the inside. But I had a big lump on the inside, so I just wanted to get it into balance. Another design decision. You see here, this epoxy is flush with where I've cut the rim. Opposite of that, it's not. I'd have to take another close to 1/2 inch off the height of the bowl to get down to there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to form this up. I'm going to pour some more epoxy and fill that up because I don't want to lose that much height in the bowl. Maybe a little different color, but I think it'll be fine. It's a small piece. You won't notice it. The other is I had a knot here, so I'm going to fill it as well because, again, I don't want to take that much off the height of the bowl. I'll continue to work away at smoothing the outside here, and then we'll get back to filling, and then start working on the inside. Just a word of safety, I am using a face shield. Whenever you're using epoxy, when you're turning that, it is brittle and it can break off, and they're glass-like shards. So when they come off, they don't feel good. So I'm wearing a face shield rather than just eye protection. Now that the epoxy is all hardened up, I just true the outside of the bowl before moving on to the inside. You'll notice that my tailstock is still engaged, again just to maintain stability and take some pressure off the tenon. At this point I really don't want the bowl tenon breaking and flying across the shop. I used a push cut to remove the material and then turned the gouge over and used a scraping cut to give a nice final surface. Someone asked me how the epoxy cuts compared to wood. It actually cuts very easily, and you do have to use either a shearing cut or a carbide tool. Initially, when you're roughing it out, as I mentioned earlier, it does tend to chip, so you want to make sure that you do use a scraping sort of cut, and that will give you a very smooth surface. And again, it does cut easy, but you can see from the mess here in my lathe, the shavings that come off it are kind of messy. Here I'm using my carbide tool, just taking a very light pass, and this works well both as a finishing cut for the wood and for the epoxy. Apologize for the shadow here, but I'm sanded on the inside, but I have just a tiny little divot right there. Now it's chip out in the epoxy, so I've got a couple choices. I take it all down to that, but everything else is good. It's only right there, and there's another one right there. So I think what I'm going to do is just use some colored CA glue. I'm going to color it green, and I'll fill that spot in and the other one, rather than try and sand it all down to there. It's the thickness that I want now, so I'd rather not go any further. But other than that, it is complete and looking really, really good inside and out. And this will soon be ready for a finish. Earlier I talked about how the epoxy cut, and it does cut well, but it does tend to have very fine micro scratches in it that are very visible. So here I'm using my homemade abrasive paste, and that's again 1,000 wet grit. And it does a good job at removing those micro scratches that may have existed in the epoxy. Also, because of the wax, it does bring out the color in the wood here. You can see how beautiful the wood is, and it darkens up as I apply this abrasive paste. Now that I've applied it, I'll rub it in with a cloth. At this point, just trying to generate a little heat. Then I'll stop and switch to a clean spot on the cloth and repeat the process, just rubbing it in. And I'll continue this until the cloth is remaining clean. Then I will know that I've removed all my abrasive paste, because I don't want to leave any of that abrasiveness behind. But you can see even here in this video, it is starting to develop some gloss, and that is not because of the finish, but rather just because of the smoothness of the wood as opposed to the wax. So here's the finished product. It turned out very, very well. So this was a crotch piece. You can see this bigger opening here was actually where the tree split and went in two different directions. This was a bark inclusion as well on the opposite side. Great opportunities for applying epoxy. Typically when I put my logo on the bottom of the bowl, I put it in the center, but I didn't want to put it in the epoxy. Therefore, I put it off to one side. One thing about the epoxy, and you can see that here, is there is a pearlescence to the epoxy. So you can see that here. It's not just a solid color, but it's actually got that pearlesque look about it. This bowl turned out to be a Christmas present. Hopefully the new owner will enjoy it for many years to come. I do think it's one of the prettiest bowls that I've done in a while, even though it does have epoxy in it. I don't do a lot of epoxy, but seeing how this one turned out, I may end up doing more of it. This bowl turned out to be about 15 inches in diameter and 4 inches deep. Leave a comment, let me know what you think, and let me know your opinion on epoxy versus leaving that as an opening.